All right, and we will cross now to the Australian Chamber of Commerce, Greg Evans, who is addressing the press on the RBA's interest rate decision.
We certainly welcome the decision today by the Reserve Bank, and this is a benefit which should be felt by all borrowers, both consumers and business. Our simple point is, though, that this is a benefit that is intended for Australian borrowers. It's certainly not intended to bolster the profitability of Australian banks. So our simple message is to the Australian banks is this is for borrowers, it's not for you. And our concern is that last time around, the 50 basis point reduction in rates last month, not all of that was passed on. And the Australian banks actually clipped the ticket on the way through, but this time the full amount of the official easing needs to be passed on to Australian borrowers. And clearly the reasons for that are clear. If you read the Reserve Bank's statement today, it does indicate that there are significant concerns internationally in terms of the flow-on impact of European instability, concerns about moderating pace in China, concerns about the recovery in the United States. Clearly, this is a very difficult picture, and it's playing out in terms of lowering confidence levels across the Australian business landscape. And we're seeing areas of particular softness and areas of where economic activity is indeed under stress in significant areas of the Australian economy, perhaps over 80% of the Australian economy, but in areas that are both trade exposed and suffering from low demand conditions. Clearly, given these low confidence levels, we certainly think it's time for the government needs to review its decision. It needs to abandon the carbon tax. When the carbon tax was conceived 18 months ago, 12 months ago, even the Reserve Bank in May last year was forecasting that 2011 growth and 2012 growth would be around 4%. Clearly the game has changed. The game has changed, and Australian business is under pressure, and this is no time to introduce a new tax. And that's at odds with the actions of the Reserve Bank today. Clearly we're in a phase of easing of monetary policy, given the circumstances, the uncertainty facing Australian business. So our message is clear. We need to abandon the carbon tax because Australian business doesn't need another cost pressure, nor do Australian households and consumers.
The Banking Association today seemed to signal that it's unlikely they'll pass on the interest rate cut in full. Treasurer Wayne Swan says that people should go and find themselves a better deal at a smaller lender or a credit union. How realistic is that?
Well, the banks, this is the normal jawboning we get from the banks prior to any Reserve Bank decision. They need to pass on this full. As I said, they clipped the ticket on the last time. Last month, they didn't pass on the full benefit of the 50 basis points, so they made money there. They really want to make money out of this decision again. In terms of the borrowers changing, well, not all businesses can actually do that easily. So what this does actually point to is why the banks get away with it. There's a lack of competition in the Australian banking system, and that's something we've seen exacerbated since in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, with less players, including less banking players, in the Australian business landscape.
The banks say that their funding costs are still high, and that's why they're unlikely to pass on this rate cut in full. Is that a fair excuse?
Well, the banks play this mystical game of regarding their funding pressures, and we understand that, but it seems like Australian borrowers, Australian business, Australian consumers are always the losers. They never end up on the right side of that particular game.
Is there now pressure, do you think, on some Labor MPs to heavy Greg Combet and the Prime Minister to try and reduce the carbon tax rate? Lower it from the $23? Oh,
look, clearly it's significantly out of whack with international prices. But we say that it's so far out of whack with what's happening internationally, given international instability. Countries across Europe are abandoning their green programs and the like and funding for them because they clearly can't afford them. I mean, the message is the game has changed. When this policy was conceived 12, 18 months ago, we thought economic growth was going to be around about over 4%. Clearly it hasn't, and this is the sort of blowtorch the Australian economy doesn't need at the moment. We're in the phase where we're reducing rates because of weakness, both brought on by international circumstances, but by the difficulties faced by a large portion of the Australian economy. Clearly we don't need a new tax. This is no time for a new tax, and it seems the only people that don't realise that are the Australian Greens and the government.
Is there onus on the government, or I suppose the Reserve Bank signalled today that the growth in China is starting to weaken. Is that a concern to your members?
Oh, look, I think it is a concern. It's just there's clearly the risks in relation to China growth are quite serious for the Australian economy, and I think it's something that needs to be taken into account, that we can't bank our economic future on one country and the domestic economic circumstances of that country being maintained at its current level. We need to have, that's why we need to embark on wider policy reform in order to make the Australian economy more productive and take off cost pressures off of Australian businesses. And you know, one of the things would be we've got to bolster this economy, and it's no time for a new tax.
Thank you.
Thank you. Coming out.
That's the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry Director of Economics and Policy, Greg Evans, speaking there. He says that there is not enough competition in the Australian banking sector, and he's also called for the government to abandon its carbon tax in the wake of the RBA's interest rate decision today.